Thanks everybody for attending. This panel is here to talk about when's a breach not a breach, or when is a breach a breach. We get to know the audience a little bit better for our panelists, so maybe you could give me a show of hands. How many people are in the legal profession? Lawyers? Work with lawyers? How many people are incident responders? Yeah, okay, several people. And how many people have been involved in a breach or worked with a breach directly? All right, great. Well, let's have the panelists introduce themselves. We'll start at the far end there. Ray, you want to go ahead?
Oh, great. My name is Raymond. I'm probably the least recognized on this panel. I'm the Chief Data Protection Officer for Fortune 500. What that means, it sounds really sexy. It's really not. I have three primary responsibilities. One is security privacy by design during the product life cycles, make sure we're baking those in. The other is awareness and communication within the organization. And the last, and probably the most relevant to this panel, is I handle and lead our incident response or breach response as it relates globally. So US as well as EU, Asia Pac, et cetera. And how do we respond to that? How do we classify a breach? And how do we do notifications?
Sorry, Jack.
So I'm Jack Daniel, and I am one of the founders of the BSides movement. Relevant to this, several years ago in Massachusetts, the TJX breach finally pushed our stalled breach notification law through, 93H, and it actually went farther than most because it specified that we had to have regulations to prevent a breach, which is the infamous 201 CMR 17, which I became heavily involved in because I read two short articles that were written by people who had not read all 4 pages of the initial draft. So somebody was wrong on the internet, and then I spent years involved in breach disclosure, breach law, and have not extricated myself from it. Plus having had to deal with a few small things back when I worked for a living. Now I'm in vendor land, so.
Thanks, Jack.
I'm Steve Werby. I'm currently a security architect at a Fortune 200. I do security research outside of my day job. Previously, I'd worked as a CISO in 3 different organizations, each of which I was involved in reportable data breaches. So I have a lot of experience with data breach notifications and the laws around those, both in the states of Texas and Virginia.
Dave.
I'm David Mortman. I'm a former CISO, recovering CISO, if you will. Never again, I always say. I'm currently a chief security architect at a large hardware and software vendor you've all heard of, and as a result, anything that might be breach related to the product that I work on, I have to work on. I've been doing breach stuff in one way or another for the last, since CA 1386 came out, which was 2004-ish, something like that.
All right, awesome. My name is Davi, so I'm volunteering to moderate this crazy panel. So I guess one of my first questions is going to be to the group, and I'll let you decide who answers first. But if you remember the Octomom scandal, you know, her information got breached, and if I remember correctly, nobody actually saw the data. The hospital just said that they discovered someone was trying to look at her records, and because they saw someone trying to look at the records, were fined for having a breach. Does this constitute a breach when someone gets caught trying to look at records of someone who's famous?
Okay. Ooh, me. So, you know, it's interesting because you brought up the EPHI example,
Yep.
the electronic personal health information, which is probably when you talk about breach notifications, the touchiest of subjects, because it's one of those, if you glance sideways at personal health information, it's you have to report it. You know, I think the interesting thing is most state breach notification laws, and for those of you who don't know, we'll just focus on the US because EU gets really more complicated. There's 46 states that have a data breach notification law. They're all different. There's 4 that don't: Alabama, Kentucky, North Dakota, one of the Dakotas, I think, and New Mexico. But all the others have some sort of breach notification. Most of them, though, say that there's a clause in there that says you have to have a reasonable assumption that the data has been accessed or whatever, unless it comes into BPHI, and then that goes into the yes, if they even think about looking at it, it is a breach. So that's an exception to the rule. In most cases, if you don't have a reasonable assumption that there's no access, then you don't have to report it.
What about possession? So I think the example we had was somebody gets a laptop with sensitive data on it, they get hit by a bus, never look at it. Is this still a breach, Jack?
This one's tricky, and this part of this came from the way the Attorney General's office in Massachusetts interprets 93H and 201 CMR 17, which require these things to be encrypted. And their expectation, either their assumption is that nothing has been properly encrypted, and therefore there's no safe harbor for encryption. And I'm really torn on this because being a pedantic security asshole, which I realize is a redundant phrase, I'm completely there because the passphrase is taped to the lid, right? We've all seen that. And therefore, as soon as you lose control, I have no faith. And there's no way to prove that it hasn't been accessed. But having worked with, so that's out of control, it's out of control. It makes me crazy, but in the real world where we're dealing with real people, I would much rather have much more relaxed interpretations because we need to give people a reason to move a little bit forward. So I know I'm straddling the fence here, but the state interpretation, the Commonwealth interpretation of Massachusetts is if you lose control of something, encrypted, unencrypted, it doesn't matter, unless you have some way to prove it wasn't accessed.
That's interesting, because in California, of course, it's the opposite. Encryption's like a safe harbor.
Right.
Steve, you identified yourself as an architect. Can we build safe enough so that they'll leave us alone?
I don't know if that's possible or not. There's no such thing as 100% security. What I think is interesting is that in this example, though, that led to this panel was a scenario where somebody takes a laptop, almost immediately is hit by a bus, and the laptop's destroyed. So we have very high assurance that the data was not accessed. And regardless of what the law has to say, my opinion is that should not be a reportable data breach, because the affected individuals never had their data accessed by somebody who's unauthorized.
So one quick comment to build on that. I think it's important, that is a breach of security. It's not necessarily a breach of data. And a lot of times we commingle that. So if something happens and it's like, oh, we have a security incident, and we all automatically start thinking data breach. That's a distinction that I don't think is heavily weighed in many organizations. They kind of treat everything else as a single umbrella. But I'm actually surprised that the 46 states that have data breach laws, they're very prescriptive about what constitutes a security breach. And both, is it unencrypted data? Is it encrypted data, but the key has been compromised? Those kind of things. So this is why the question about how many of you deal with law and legal, I report to the general counsel of my organization, which has been a learning experience for me. But the interesting thing is that interpretation drives the hearts and minds of your organization, because that's going to be what your penalties are going to be, whether or not you're going to disclose and the ethics behind it. So if you don't know somebody in the legal profession, or you don't deal with them on a regular basis, and you're handling data breach incidents, find somebody, talk to somebody, and there's some good sites out there we can talk about later.
All right, Dave, so you're a recovering CIO, so maybe you can be frank with us, tell us what it's really like. But what's the point of reporting breaches? Does it help when you get these breaches reported? You can change your policies,
And I think that the goal of many of these laws, having talked to folks in a lot of states who are in the process of building these laws, is to give customers transparency into what may have happened to their data, so that people could choose to go, engage in a credit reporting service, or just monitor their health records. If their physician lost it, lost the records, understand how they got lost. So you can say, was it, not necessarily for the purpose of suing, but like, if my doctor is, lost their files because, lost my records because they left their filing cabinet and front door unlocked, that doesn't give me a great comfort about their general skills as, as a business person, as a physician, so I might want to make some choices about that. On the other hand, if it was, the laptop was encrypted and, someone broke into their house and cracked the safe it was in, I'm like, okay, this person's trying really hard, but I still might want to be monitoring other things going on, start looking for, watch my insurance reports come in, make sure there's not suddenly like medications being ordered in my name or something like that. And I think it's more about transparency than anything else. I mean, certainly most of these laws have the ability for a class action lawsuit against organizations. And that's really where the safe harbor comes in. So like Indiana, for instance, if the data is encrypted and the key is not with the data, there's safe harbor. But that situation like where the passphrase is written on the box of tapes, or the secure ID token is in the laptop bag, then you have to, and therefore someone who has it can then, unencrypt the laptop.
Well, developers are notorious for putting the key next to the encrypted file, so that
Right.
it'd be easy to
And if you're dealing with like servers that need to auto boot, you end up in logical loop problems about how do you manage that automatically without lots of software added on. You just can't do that. So either you have no passphrase on your key,
All right,
or
let's
you have the key right there.
Let's take transparency for a second, though. So it's about people. I mean, like in California, we have I believe it's a 5-day notice now window because people need to know as soon as possible that their information has been breached. But do we really care? I mean, okay, have to care that people need to know their information's been breached. But isn't the purpose, if we look at like the airline industry, to really know what went wrong, so we don't have planes flying around that are about to crash? So is the point of the breach notification really about the victims, or is it about protecting them?
Well, in my opinion,
Go ahead,
I
please.
mean, so one of the so for the state laws, it started as a transparency victim protection thing. If you look at high tech, which is the recent update to HIPAA a couple years ago, one of the things that was mandated as part of that is notification of the ways things were breached to a central authority.
Yeah.
And then you start getting into usable information like the NTSB gathers for the airlines. So that way you can start, as carriers of this data, you can start understanding the ways in which other people are breached and you can be more effective.
Is it weird that they require more than 500 to be the watermark?
Well, not, so this,
More than
I'm
500 people
going to
affected.
differ a little bit on the consumer protection aspect of it. And the reason I say that is because if you look at most of the notification laws, the notification of the Attorney General or the broader disclosure, none of the triggers are the same. Some are automatic, some are before notification, some are after notification. In fact, the notification event is what triggers the action. Some are 500 records, some are 1,000 records. There's an inconsistency there. The other thing is if you look at the states, the statutes on the states and how many actually have a private right to action, going back to your class action lawsuits, 30 of those states have no private right to action. So if you actually come forth with a data breach, 30 states will not allow a civil case for class action because your data was compromised. And only 25 of them are even prescriptive in any sort of, $500 per record or anything like that. Most of them don't even, 50% don't even have that. So I think a lot of it is more about, to your point, if it's a specific agency or a specific type of data, that kind of thing is more of protecting the industry itself. And the consumer is almost second that process.
So protecting the industry is an excellent point. Are we really seeing harm of the consumers? Can they prove that they've been harmed when their data has been breached?
Well, I don't know that they can, and the kind of things we're talking about in terms of the action they would take, in my opinion, are the kinds of things they should be doing anyway. Everyone should be reviewing their credit reports, monitoring their financial records. Individuals are seeing so many data breaches involving their data that I believe they're becoming quite numb to it. And so I don't know that incrementally they are doing or should be doing anything differently if they get a data breach notification letter versus if they did not.
Wouldn't it or doesn't it also function as a punishment against an organization that allows a data breach to happen?
It depends on the level of exposure, right? So in some cases, you're going to have a penalty depending on the type of data. In most cases, those are going to be capped. For a large organization, if it's capped at like $50,000 and that's the maximum penalty that you can pay out, that's not a lot, right? The other thing is then you look at brand reputation. So I think if Ponymon has the statistics, I think the average cost of the organization in the U.S. is $5.5 million, not counting the outliers, $3 million lost business and that kind of thing. For most of the large brands that are already established, either they already have a kind of captive audience. It's not like you're going to suddenly tear up your American Express card if you get a thing saying your card might have been compromised. Or they can handle it in a different way through a different sales channel and recover. I think that's the issue is the consumers are becoming desensitized, but organizations are becoming more desensitized unless they stand to lose a lot. Like if it's an online startup and all you have is your reputation, you're screwed. But Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 200 companies, probably not. You'll pick up, move on, send out a few checks.
Well, let's go back to the definition of a breach. So if the cost of responding to a breach is significant and the reputational risk and the damage, I mean, how much is this really about the definition? So are people trying really hard to avoid being exposed, avoid being found in violation of?
Oh yeah.
So what are they doing to avoid breaches? Are they actually fixing their systems, or are they trying to find ways that they don't have to report breaches?
So Dave's probably got to figure this too, but I think some people are actually trying to fix their systems. Now I don't want to think like evil corporations are all out there all trying to get each other. My company, my role, a lot of it is making sure we're building in the right controls from the start of the process. But I think what's interesting about this is there's just not enough compelling reason, and you get stuck in the legal definition. Most of the exceptions that we talk about safe harbor, they're not actually called out in the law itself around notification. It's called out in the definition of what a security breach is. So you start to split the language up, and then it becomes well, what is our liability? Well, it's all based on a few words in this definition, and we can fight that.
Anybody remember what the cost of the breach was for South Carolina, the Mandy investigation? How much did that cost?
A lot, but yeah.
$35 million.
The breach cost $35 million?
All the incident costs added up together. I got a slide in.
35 million?
Yeah, there were estimated another $7 million of external costs would occur after the $25 million that they've already had spent at the point of releasing.
And what was the cost of avoiding that breach?
Well, that's a good question.
Nobody has data on that. Weren't they trying to hire a CIO or a CISO or something? Wasn't that they couldn't fill a position that was a security officer?
Yeah.
All right, so
That was one of those after the fact ones that came out. Some people who were in technology and IT in the state had a very different view of what happened. That's I forget the exact quote, but the governor made some fantastic quips about how hard it is to do security.
all right, so
Basically, she said math is hard is pretty much what she said about crypto. Said nobody actually, you'd be amazed who doesn't encrypt social security numbers. Nobody does because like maths is hard. Did the state a great reputation, but
let me give you another example.
I have something a question.
Okay.
Because I'm the poor unfortunate bastard that found the largest state leak in the state of Texas. The amount of money that our state spent just to basically portray we're doing something and done something about it. In fact, public records in South Carolina's case, everybody got to see the data. Texas, not so much. Nobody really knows how much our Texas event costs. I do, but not many people do. The reality is,
Would you like to share?
no improvement in security.
How much did it cost?
Around 25.
25 million.
It was $2.5 million just to send out the notifications, which under Texas law requires web notification only. But our as comptroller decided that we were going to send a letter to every person, outsource that.
Yeah, notification's a huge cost, and sometimes you can
$3.5
get through public
million
channels.
lost records, that was $2.5 million in that.
So I want to focus back on the definition though. So let me give you another example. One of the largest breaches in history apparently was from the VA. And the VA said that they had lost a RAID disk, one disk. When they sent it back for OEM repair or something, no one could account for where it went, and it was part of an Oracle database. So when you have a disk that has, just a piece of an entire puzzle and it's a piece of an Oracle database, is this a breach because they lost that piece of their environment? No one can really reconstruct the data potentially.
Maybe.
Yeah, I think it depends on what was actually on the disk.
So that gets back to, because definitions is what we're talking about. Is that
It's encoded.
is that a breach of data? I don't think so. I mean, can somebody get data from that of value? No, that doesn't matter. The legal definition is actually what matters, right? Because we can argue about when we actually lose control, but we're up against the legal definition, and if the legal definition isn't clear enough, and thankfully all laws are written clearly in plain English by people who are subject matter experts.
Unbiased.
Unbiased to not beholden to their wife's business or lobbyists.
Well, let me update.
Now, one thing to build on that real quick. One, it's the Queen's English. It's not actually normal English. But I think it's funny because the definition of personal information, there's a commonality across the 46 states that have that. But usually that commonality stops at first name, first initial, and last name, and a combination of like some identifier, right? So that's how you identify data. And one element by itself is not enough. But then you start getting into all the exceptions at the different state levels of now we are expanding the definition, and some of that's around EPHI. It's almost impossible to stay up on top of what is personal information anymore. The scope is expanded so greatly that it's almost better to just say encrypt the fuck out of everything and just assume it's all personal information.
Let's do a quick survey then. I believe Canada, the privacy commissioner there, said email is part of your sensitive information.
IP address sometimes?
Yeah.
So how many people agree? Email, private, sensitive information?
NSA.
What, 3 people? Come on.
How many people wish it were, but no, it's not.
All right. So let me update that example, right? So you have the RAID drive and you have the Oracle database, and this was an old example. Some people call it the largest breach in history. Some people say it's not a breach. What about in these new environments? 40,000 clusters or nodes in a Hadoop environment. One of them disappears. It has some piece of data that was sent to it so it could do some processing in parallel. Is that a breach? Because it had sensitive data?
So to reiterate something you said earlier, the DBIR is misinterpreted year after year after year. And this year they made a big effort to try to reduce that. But they also this year talked to me. They focus on we know something got away, not we lost a laptop, you know, whatever it is. And so they segregate those two out, and that's what we're talking about here. Is did it really get breached, or did we just not have the control, right? And so I mean that's like where the insider threat. If you look at the insider threat is devastating. DBIR says for the ones that we know that somebody got our stuff, it's a rounding error.
Those are the difference between like I misplaced my keys and someone stole my car.
Right. So that's a couple of weeks, right before hopping in the car to drive out here, I stopped at Home Depot to grab a couple of things and dropped my credit card. And I was like, it's Home Depot, and looking at the sketchy people at Home Depot, and so I called the credit card company, and it was used within 10 minutes. Right, so and Home Depot is one of those where they'll take the risk of no signature up to about $75 or something. But you know they got reversed. The bank took care of it for me. But there's what we're talking about. I don't know where my credit card is. I've rifled the truck and all the bags. Shit, where am I? And that's the big undefined. Hello? No, I only made one purchase at Home Depot. Now we've got to confirm the breach. But it's not that simple most of the time, right? It's like we can't call the PLA and say, do you have the plans to the next generation of our phone scanner? It turns out that they don't answer, they don't speak English, and they won't tell us the truth anyway.
Oh, they speak English.
Well,
So I can give you the opposite example. This really weird thing happened to me. I found a credit card, and being the good citizen I am, I called up the credit card company on the back and I said, I found this card. Probably somebody jogging, dropped it in the park or something. And they made me say my name, they wanted my address, they wanted my phone number, they wanted to like contact me later, call me back. I was like, I don't want to give you anything. I want to tell you I have this card. Do I destroy it? You know, now that you know that it's been lost? And they wanted me to stay on hold. So for half an hour, I sort of argued with them before I was like, okay, I'm destroying the card. You can notify that person that their card wasn't used and you can close the account. But let me go to for me, the most troubling example of all. Maybe we can get a vote on this, but
I shouldn't be surprised by that, as bitter and jaded as I am, but it's just like, hey, I'm heading off a problem for you. Oh, thanks. Yeah, tear that up. Thank you very much, sir. Click. No,
that was what I expected, but it turned out to be. And the fact they wanted my personal information, I was so tempted to give them the name on the card.
But and then turn it into a state for data breach?
Right. Well, and if you expand the example, because I think it's, that's small scale, right? But we go back to do enterprises disclose breaches as early as they should. In most cases, they're going to find every nuance as to not to disclose it because of the difficulty of dealing with it after the fact. Because they're looking at, okay, the FTC comes involved, and yes, Wyndham's trying to fight whether or not FTC actually has authority. But now you get, okay, am I going to get audited for 20 years? What's the penalties? They make it so difficult to be part of that process of, hey, names and addresses were compromised. We want to get this information out there to help our consumers, help us get that message. And then it becomes more of a, we want attribution of punishment. We're going to lynch you, and that's a deterrent for a lot of organizations.
This is where I was going. So in the case of the UCLA breaches, they thought they closed, this is common of course, the CEO responded back to the regulators, the auditors, we took care of the problem, we fired the person who was breaching the data. And then it happened again. Okay, we took care of the problem, we fired the people we think were responsible, and then it happened again. So at what point is breach notification a cause for alarm to really get down to the source of the problem as opposed to firing some random person or trying to cover it up? Ultimately, that's what led to 2 new laws in California because they wanted to be more careful about when they investigate breaches.
Well, if you look at the data breaches and what's actually occurring in a lot of cases, somebody inadvertently leaving a laptop in their car, and an organization already has a policy against leaving laptops unattended, or other things that involve a human making a mistake or not following the existing administrative policy or technical policy not being put in place. So I believe it is quite common for someone being made a scapegoat in a case like that. But inside the organizations, maybe for a short period of time, there's some additional interest in security awareness and other things to ensure it will never happen again. That's the sort of term that I'm used to hearing. But is that really doing any good? And when we look at it from the standpoint of whether the data is actually a potential risk of being utilized in an unauthorized way, there was a case, TRICARE, it's an insurance company for the government. So it was in San Antonio while I was living there last year. Somebody parked their car with a backup tape in it 2 blocks from our house, and someone stole the car or broke into the car. I don't believe they actually broke in to get access to the backup tape. And it's unlikely they're going to utilize that information to cause any harm, but some large number of millions of people had to be notified because of that. Did that really make a lot of sense? So in my opinion, we're focusing on the wrong things with these data breach notification laws that we have no control over. We have paper data that I believe in only 7 states it actually requires data breach notification. The laws largely revolve around electronic data. I think if I asked anybody in the room if you'd be upset if an organization exposed your password, you probably would be. Question for the rest of the panel, is that a data breach in the United States?
Password loss? Password exposure?
Just in general, with no other criteria, is that a data breach?
So
a lot of organizations report it, but are they actually required to?
So how many passwords?
Well, like, okay, so
499.
Barracuda Labs, right? Or Barracuda had their HD password exposed, right? The guy was Googling around, found HD password, all clear text. Is that a breach?
From my perspective, I'd say it is. And the reason I say that is because it then enables the access, right? So it's the losing the keys portion. We go back to the unencrypted data, or you've lost the control mechanism that protects that information. In that case, you've lost the control mechanism. So I would call that a breach by my standards.
So I would not, based on how the data breach notification laws are worded, but it might just be my misunderstanding of them. If it doesn't involve my first initial or first name and last name in combination with social security number or financial information, if it's my Google email address, which does not have my name in it, is that a data breach? I don't believe it is in most states according to the law, but I'm more uncomfortable having that information compromised than I am my social security number or credit card. Because as a consumer, I have pretty much zero liability if my credit card's compromised. It'll be a nuisance for me because I'll have to get a new card and change it with some organizations that do automatic billing and that type of thing. And I just assume that my social security number has been breached so many times that the important thing for me to do is to monitor my credit periodically and just check for identity fraud involving my identity.
But there are some states, by the way, that are now pushing for electronic IDs to become part of that personal information criteria, including email addresses for that very reason. And I think when you look at it from an organizational perspective, how many of you work for an organization that does business in one state? So usually what ends up happening is the most arduous condition or definition of personal information is when you have to abide by. So I think more and more organizations are going to have to start taking electronic IDs and other things that are typically viewed as high risk as part of that data breach schema. So if my email address gets compromised and my password gets compromised, it may not be personal information in, say, Wyoming. By the way, I can't remember Wyoming off the top of my head, so forgive me. But if it is in one state, then I have to send out a notification to those customers if I'm doing business with anybody in that state. So it does become kind of an effective cycle of the most arduous always wins.
That's a choice point learned.
Yeah.
Years ago was that Choice Point got severely breached, and they said we only need to notify in 3 states, whatever it was. They only had to notify in some states, even though they had customers who were compromised in many more states. And they said the law says we need to notify in these states, so that's what they did. And then it became quite clear the breach was much larger, and they got raked over the coals by Congress. And there was class action lawsuits, that mostly went away because there was no grounds to sue in those states. But it was a valuable lesson in disaster management and business event management.
That's right. And the only reason they notified was because they had California customers who required it. And
Exactly.
Kicked it off. So, I mean, it also could go the other way, right? So people might not want to do business with certain states or have customers. I think people have talked about, do they want to have Michigan customers in their databases because of the encryption requirement, right? Michigan, no. Massachusetts.
Well, I think, but it's funny because that actually brings up another important point of clarification. And Jack, you may correct me because I know you've been more heavily involved in that. But I maintain a spreadsheet of like all 46 states' laws, penalties, and everything else. And the the encryption actually is specified is only for encryption of data in transit or on portable devices.
Portable devices.
There's nothing actually prescriptive
Like
about
virtual
database.
machines that move around.
But there's nothing prescriptive about database level encryption.
If you vMotion a virtual machine, is that portable?
But as long as it's a transit public,
Yeah.
it's
Public
public
space.
network. Public
Right.
network is the
PCI is the same way.
And there's this giant loophole in that which says where practical or whatever, where reasonable. And I got into a little heated discussion during one of the hearings on it because people kept saying, well, this is fine because people will make a good faith effort. And I was the only privacy advocate in the room. Everybody else is from the business community. So if the business community had been making a good faith effort, we would not be here right now. Right. So
And public-private space, how's that defined? You know, if you lose a laptop in your parking lot, that's private space. So.
yeah, and then there's the public-private. So in the Commonwealth, the executive branch of government has EO 501, the executive order, which corresponds to 201 CMR 17. But other parts of state and municipal government don't have it. So it's possible that an agency can make your day ugly because you had a breach that themselves has no concern for your information as a corporate or personal entity of the state.
All right, so here's the most troubling question for me. What about the German argument that any system that has U.S. access is breached because they assume the U.S. government's got super secret spy control?
I'm in global health right now since Snowden, because we do global business. We have business in the EU, we have business in Asia Pac and others, and now, of course, I think in the last week or two, they're talking about reopening safe harbor, to investigate that because it's no longer an assurance of control. And now granted, self-assessment has never been a real assurance of anything, other than I'm just telling you what I say I'm going to do. But it's becoming more of a challenge doing business in those different countries if you're a U.S.-based entity.
Right.
So now there's a lot of focus on, do we have to put data centers within the foreign nation, keep the data contained?
Right.
Now, of course, you get into issues about no single view of customers. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that go around that. That's the extreme that I think at some point in time is going to hurt commerce. Now, business is going to have to.
Well, you have possession, custody, and control, right?
Right.
So if an American has control of a system, does that constitute a breach because it's no longer trusted?
It's not just
The
the
argument
it's
there,
the-
and I'll defer to David. My observation on this, because he's an actual cloud expert. I just play one on Twitter. I don't think it's a problem because no one would be stupid enough to store data in the cloud unencrypted or encrypted and trust the cloud service provider with the encryption keys. Nobody would be that dumb. So right? Please, you, dear
Please
God.
surprise.
Please, dear God. Okay, so it depends on your level of skill, right?
Well, I think part of the problem is that in a lot of organizations, I don't actually have a specific example of proof of someone doing this, but in a lot of organizations, people are like, get handed access to something, and they don't ask where it is.
Right.
So like, so I need a resource, and they have not personally launched the service on Amazon or Rackspace or Google or whatever. They just have an application they're using. They have no idea where it is,
Right.
and they shove data into it, or they don't care. So I was talking with the CISO of a very large UK-based pharmaceutical firm, and they discovered that their developers were doing, researchers really, were doing high-end computational modeling of new drugs they were getting ready to put to market on Amazon because they put a request in, and IT told them, well, you'll get those computers in 6 months, or 3 months, whatever it was, and the developers were like, we have deadlines to meet. I have a credit card, so they fired up a bunch of systems, ran their models, and took like, 6 hours or whatever, and then shut the systems down.
Right.
And that wasn't a violation. There was no, confidential information in terms of customers or clients or patients. However, it was just their, their IP for undeveloped drugs that were not yet to market, which is only worth, billions of dollars. So he's tearing his hair out.
So, perfect example. So Amazon does not wipe your data when you decommission an instance. They only wipe it when you commission an instance. So if you decommission, your data is still sitting there on those servers. Is it a breach when someone else accesses that data? They don't know what it is. They just start accessing an instance without being wiped. If it doesn't get wiped properly when it gets commissioned, in other words.
And this is hardly, this is true for most cloud service providers. They don't wipe the data when volumes are decommissioned.
Only with provisions they clean this space.
Well, Amazon did not label the S3 violation. A partner might have found this roughly about the same time around 7 bit. We met with them and explained what it is that can be accessed, and let's just say he was in the process of seeing what he could get, and it was quite shocking. Amazon never took that as a data breach, even though we had full access to it. When we gave them all the information, Raymond 7 gave them all the information.
Did they say why? Why is that not a
They
breach?
promised to get back to us in 5 days. We touched base with them a couple times.
Because there are penalties.
Probably because it wasn't there.
I don't, that too. I also don't think.
So this brings
So
up a
they
very.
never released that.
I experienced that myself. Yes.
No custody, no control, no possession.
Well, exactly. So this goes back to unauthorized cloud providers, and a lot of you are going to sit here and if I ask how many of you have unauthorized cloud running in your organizations, show of hands.
Everyone raise your hands.
If your developer has a credit card, you probably have unauthorized cloud, or if they have a Dropbox account, right?
Well, does that constitute a breach?
Well, hold on.
When somebody starts running a cloud and puts data on it?
Well, here's the issue, because what you lose is visibility and transparency. So the Amazon example is a perfect example. You may have already decommissioned that instance, and to you, that's gone, right? That's going to be recommissioned for somebody else. Data may or may not be resident. You're probably not going to know about that, though. So the visibility to be able to detect the breach, which is just as important as anything that comes subsequent.
But when
to
you
that.
find out your data's on a cloud provider, is that a breach?
Maybe.
Maybe.
So on a related note, so if you fall under HIPAA/HITECH/HIPAA 2.0, whatever you want to call it, if you have a business associate who processes data for you, and what the definition of a business associate is a little unclear in some cases, you are required to have that business associate sign an agreement that's saying that they will fully comply with HIPAA and its associated requirements. At one end of the spectrum, you have like the co-processor who actually takes your healthcare information and generates pretty charts and graphs or stores your data for you with some sort of e-health record system. That's clearly a business associate. At the other end of the spectrum, you have UPS. They're shipping your backup tapes. They are clearly not a business associate. So for the purposes of if you're a healthcare provider, you don't have to have UPS or FedEx or the US Postal Service sign that document. Amazon will not sign a business associates agreement with you. They flat refuse to do that, and their argument is, we are a carrier, much like when you get a circuit from AT&T or Verizon or Sprint or anyone else, they're not signing the BAA because they're just a carrier, just like UPS, just like FedEx. They have no insight into your data, and that is their argument. And plenty of organizations will agree with that interpretation.
Right.
And as such, if you have healthcare-related information in Amazon that gets breached in that situation, you are solely responsible for it. Amazon will say, not our problem.
Okay, but if UPS loses that box, it's a breach.
Right.
If Amazon can't account for your data.
It's right. Well, in that situation, you as the healthcare provider are the one who still owns responsibility. You have no ability to assign that blame to Amazon because they have not signed it yet.
Yeah, essentially.
They're carrying.
I think they notified the people that we notified them whose data was there, because we talked to some of the people that found data and said, we found that, you need to go take care of it.
I think they have an ethical responsibility, and moral responsibility to notify them. But in terms of rules like HIPAA, they're just a carrier. They have no visibility into
Well,
that.
and they have no direct relationship with the consumer or the customer in this case. And the other thing is the standard that we kind of established in my organization, because I just pushed for it, was you can transfer responsibility for many different things that you do with your business. You can't transfer accountability. So at the end of the day, what happens to that is going to fall on your shoulders. And to your point, most providers are not going to sign up for anything that holds them liable for any of this. And you have to be very careful when you're talking about the cloud parts. Because how many of you done like a data flow analysis on cloud or understanding where geographies the data is going to go into, right? We're scraping data across multiple data centers. I'm noticing not a lot of hands are shooting up. And I think this goes back to a fundamental problem on breach detection, especially when dealing with cloud providers. Most people, we do a crappy job of inventorying data. We do an even more crappy job of classifying data. And we do the worst job of actually assigning controls based on where the data is going. And most organizations just don't have a good handle on that, and it takes a while to get there, but until you do, you really don't have enough visibility, and the notification conversation is almost premature.
All right, so 2 tough examples on that. Don't get me started on beating up Amazon, since we brought it up.
Anybody from Amazon in the room? Okay, good.
Any Amazon partners?
But so one example is ITAR, right? So the United States has a regulation that says only US citizens can touch this data at any time. Any other person who's not a US citizen touching it, breach. So Amazon provided an ITAR compliant facility in their cloud by building a dedicated data center that was completely separate, with only certain people had access to it at any one time. So does that show responsibility for breaches because they're providing a more secure service to comply with ITAR?
Maybe. So if you want to use GovCloud, which is what you're talking about, you need to sign a really heavy-duty contract with Amazon, stating that you will not allow any non-U.S. citizen or green carded, because green card folks are allowed in this situation as well, to have access to those systems or to those systems that are hosted on Amazon. You are not allowed to put anything rated higher than FSMA moderate rather, on those systems. And if you do put confidential information or FSMA high or higher classified systems, you will bear the cost of destroying those systems and the replacement systems as well. So they are actually pushing back, Amazon's pushing that stuff back onto you as the consumer, guaranteeing that you will remain compliant with ITAR.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think it's less about Amazon taking responsibility for breaches because it's still being pushed back on the customer as much as just being able to sell to the government. You know, and it sounds very cynical, but that's really
Well, that's what you have to do.
Yeah, but you're also seeing a niche now. I know there's like a layer tech or something like that. You're getting more of these compliant hosting providers that are starting to pop up. Terramark's doing that as well, where it's we'll sign up for a subset of controls. Let's say PCI, that's a good example. We'll take responsibility for things that would traditionally be in your boat, but you're still ultimately accountable if we did something wrong.
So using the analogy of the UPS or the FedEx truck, you know, one of my favorite examples is the guy who pulled up for a Starbucks, went inside for a drink, came back out, and the tapes were missing. Is the carrier responsible? Is that a breach that the carrier has to take some responsibility for? Like, you no longer use that carrier, right? Because you're stopping at Starbucks and leaving the doors unlocked. Or is that really the responsibility of the person buying the service? It's entirely their
The
responsibility.
penalties are going to fall to the person who bought the service. They're really going to fall to the carrier who's delivering the tapes.
And again, this is tapes are missing, not tapes were used.
Right.
So, breach.
That's going to depend on the contracts with the carrier.
That's true.
What the carrier is taking responsibility for. So, like, getting back to Amazon, just because I know them well, they are certified PCI compliant. What this means is you can potentially build an application that you can certify as PCI compliant on Amazon. You still need to be assessed and all that, but Amazon will give you a document that says, here are the physical security controls required by whatever 6 or 7, whatever the required, whichever the standard subset of PCI is required. And we manage the portions of the patch management and configuration management of the hypervisor layer because PCI mandates that you secure the entire stack. In that situation, if you have a breach and you can establish that it was a physical security breach or a hypervisor level issue that Amazon should have handled, you probably have an argument that Amazon has some responsibility there. What the reality is there's not been a single breach in the history of PCI where the PCI Council has said you are PCI compliant at the time you were assessed, at the time of your breach, and therefore you're not in trouble. Every single breach that's happened, the PCI Council has declared that person not PCI compliant at the time of the breach.
Well, and look at Heartland, right? You know, with the Heartland breach, I mean, the big thing was the pushback initially was always, well, our auditor said we were fine, you know, we're PCI compliant, and of course that calls into question the actual, like, the skill set of the auditors who are doing the assessments and the education around that. So it is funny because even most of the organizations that do get breaches say they're PCI compliant, they aren't because they got breached.
Well, isn't the point of the breach definition that to be breached, you are non-compliant?
Well, maybe.
Well, yeah, because there are things that come outside of that. Like you could have all the controls in the world. There's always going to be the exceptions to that process. Go ahead, Dave. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying is that you can. I personally believe it's possibly compliant. Being compliant does not mean you're not vulnerable.
Right.
And the question, of course, the big argument is, were you sufficiently meeting the letter of the law? And if so, I mean, all PCI says, in the essence, is if you are compliant with all of these things, then we cannot penalize you if you are breached. So it is very much in the PCI Council's best interest, financially, for you not to be compliant at the time of the breach.
Well, is it really binary or is it a sliding scale? So the more compliant you are, the lower the fines.
Well,
I'm not.
Who's a QSA?
I wouldn't admit it either. It's okay.
yeah.
But I think it depends on what the piece. I think it depends on who the council, who the QSA is, and what happened.
And a PA QSA.
But I also, Dave brings a really great point though. Compliance doesn't equal security. You know, so we go back to Jack making a comment about people are just going to do this based on good faith, right? You know, and I'm almost exploding on this side because it's so laughable. How many of you saw the California Attorney General's report on data breaches? Okay, so 2.5 million breaches, which I think represents a little over 6% of the population of California, were exposed in 2012. 1.5, 1.4, so about 45% of those, in the Attorney General's opinion, but it's probably true, could have been averted by just using basic security controls like encryption of data and those kind of things.
They're not counting wiretap, obviously.
Right, they're not counting wiretap. But that shows the level of concern and incompetence and other things of some of these organizations. It's not a complicated problem to avert a data incident. We can fuzz it with APTs and all this other wonderful stuff out there. But in most cases, it just comes down to practice and common sense and having good security people and good assurance officers. And a lot of organizations fall short.
The question I asked the
They're costs. They're not there ignoring the costs. I mean, look at South Carolina. They had no, Texas, we had no idea how much that would have cost.
Right.
None.
Okay. So,
Sure.
like when CA 1386 came out, I had this big meeting with our lawyers, and we're discussing what do we need to do, what changes do we need to make. And the first question I asked is, what if we don't do anything? What is the cost to us? And with CA 1386, there's no financial penalties, 0 at the time, for not being compliant if there was a breach. The only potential penalty is that that there could be a class action lawsuit against us. And the fact is, before CA 1386, there could have been a class action lawsuit. All it did was give us safe harbor if things had been encrypted. And we were planning it anyway, so we did it. But one of the big questions you need to ask yourself as an organization is, what is the potential cost? What's the risk to me of not being compliant versus the cost of maintaining compliance? And that's a question a lot of organizations say, you know what? We're willing to pay the fine.
Okay.
Which is why high-tech rate jacked up the costs of fines, because a lot of healthcare organizations like, maximum fine, 50 grand. Cost of compliance, $10 million.
Right.
Well, they had since '97 to move on this dial, so.
But
I got
still.
another thing in South Carolina.
Yeah.
They just reported that they had 1 million people sign up for the credit check. That cost them $12 million for that alone.
Yep.
That's the part.
Okay, now I'm sorry, but you know how much I can do with $12 million?
Yeah.
And that's just in credit report.
I have some stock in one of those credit reporting companies, so I'm really happy right now.
It might be big because that's.
You know what's funny though? None of the states require credit monitoring fees for remediation.
But it's political, see, in our perspective, and, my comptroller, I'll
Yeah.
leave her name out of it, she's retiring, so it doesn't matter. It will never happen again, she's retiring. It's the reputation, it's the irrational behavior that occurred after that.
And I agree with you, but I think what my point was is it's not required at a state level, but we're so readily doing it and costing millions of dollars for the organization, where we would have done something with that money up front to protect the organization, could avoid the entire problem. So that's the other thing about that risk-reward kind of culture, risk aversion, those kind of things. If you don't have foresight into what it's actually going to do and impact your organization, you're going to pay for it at some point in time, but then you're going to have a greater impact on other consumers and your customers and your brand.
Right, so
As much as this is, we're talking about our world here, it's not just InfoSec that has this issue. We take our shoes off going through the airport every time because of an overreaction. We're chasing symptoms. It's like you said about UCLA. It's like, we fired the guy. We fired the guy. We fired the guy. Or, the Army focusing on Manning. It's like, why the F did they have access? My question was, Snowden. We can argue politics. That's fun to argue the politics and all that nonsense. But why did Snowden have access to what he had access to? Why did Manning have access to what he had access to? Why did the fundamentals? Well, we put Bradley in jail. We're safe. No, wait, no. The next kid that no.
So that's one of the toughest questions. Let me ask you. In the security industry, we often see flaws and we don't think people are fixing them fast enough. Do we err on the side of trying to announce breaches, pointing to breaches? Do breaches help the security community to the point where we maybe overemphasize them?
So here's the conundrum here. Most people in security aren't going to be the ones responsible for making the call on whether or not you actually announce a breach. And it's going to be one of like 20 different factors that the organization's considering when they're making that determination. So from our perspective, it would be great if we had more visibility and transparency in the breaches that happen, the root cause analysis behind those, and we learn from those. And the whole idea of like sharing information on the cybersecurity kind of infrastructure.
When you say don't have control, you mean they're not involved in
What
leaking
authority?
information.
They have no authority to sign off.
But they could leak information that would lead to a breach.
And then they're going to be out of a job, and they're
Yeah,
going to
they
have the
get caught.
ability. But this is the thing: it's like the leaking of whistleblowers, and most team people here want to stay employed. They probably have mortgages to pay, and kids to feed, and there comes that fine line of I have my personal thoughts on when we should announce breaches, but ultimately, if the general counsel and the CEO says we're not going to announce it, we're not going to announce it. And I'm going to sleep well because I prevented it, but I'm also going to have my job the next day. So it's a challenging spot for us.
But are we secretly celebrating when we hear another breach report because it makes our case stronger?
Secretly,
I don't think we are anymore. I think for a while, but now everybody's got fatigue, and one of the things that we don't get out of the breach report is, forgive me for the phrase, actionable intelligence, right? We're just getting simple raw numbers, and at first that was kind of cool because it's like, it's not quite as much of a stigma to get popped. It happens to everybody. Wow, it's depressing. It happens to everybody. Oh, look, another breach. And even where we get information, it's like, oh, a SQL injection. Oh, a SQL injection. Oh, we're not getting the level of detail except from, vendor reports. Granted, DBIR is a lot more than a vendor report these days, but it's still, all this data is going out there, and it's annoying some customers because they keep getting, consumers are getting too much stuff. And
well, flip side, does it make us look bad? Does the security industry look like idiots because we have so many breaches?
Oh,
we don't need
that's
any help
excuses.
there.
Yeah, so, I mean, I love what you're saying, because this is something that really, like, this is my thing. We are just, the average person in this room, I'll bet, you can ask 50% of the people, they have had stuff that they wanted to report, but they were not allowed to.
Why I live in the state of Texas.
That is a huge problem.
All right, I
We
think
know
we're out of
something's
time.
going on.
So to derail this to a topic that's near and dear to my heart and has been around here, that frustration is part of the burnout in this industry too. The shit we know they can't say.
I mean,
I didn't take it. I'll talk about Texas all day long. I won't take it. I'm going to go get happy at my job, and I'm not going to expect the comptroller to make me happy.
Yeah,
I'm not going to
but-
cover
yeah,
up some stupid decision. Not gonna happen.
But your personality disorders skew in a different direction than most personality disorders in our industry.
But look at TGX. We've had this conversation. They released coupons, realized their stock went up because of that, and didn't fix anything in theory. So, I mean,
TJ, yeah, having been from Texas and having been, from Massachusetts, having had TJX headhunters attempt to recruit me repeatedly, yeah.
I mean, the thing
They rolled out the lipstick, and they put it on both ends of the pig, and it worked.
That's true. I mean, retail in general, when they have problems, they run a sale, right? Everybody comes back.
but it worked. It's a great marketing campaign. I think it's cheap.
But it can't work for every industry.
No.
I think it goes to show that people have a very short half-life with their information getting breached, especially since they realize from a credit card perspective it has almost no impact again. And so I feel like we're putting too much focus on the wrong thing, and we're constrained by the laws. It's great. It used to be great when we found out there was a data breach because it allowed us to get resources. Now, our executives already heard this. We've all had data breaches, so it doesn't really help. If anything, it leads to us focusing on protecting the wrong kind of data, in my opinion.
no, actually, a couple of things that have been I found really interesting. One is that in the retail space, the organization needs to suffer 3 breaches before they have significant turnover. So actually, despite the publicity, so from when I'm working with a client that's in the retail industry, I encourage them to report because people are like, okay, they're human, that happens. Surely they fix the problem. And then they go back until the 3rd time. The other interesting thing is when you start, yeah, pretty much. The other cool thing is that when you start looking at, like you start talking to folks like Debex, I forget what they rebrand themselves, and folks like these credit monitoring folks who help. One of the things they found is the larger the breach of like credit card information, the less likely it is that your information is going to be used.
Right.
So I don't really worry about those big breaches where they say 500,000 or 2 million credit cards were stolen, like
500.
whatever it happens to be. It just doesn't matter.
Yeah, 6 cards stolen. All of them are used within minutes.
Right. That's what we have to worry about it. The other thing is that
Well,
if
it
you
goes back to high tech. You said 500, right? Is the breach watermark?
I think that's 500 records. But the other thing is that I think anything less than 500 is probably a targeted attack personally. Is that the value of a stolen credit card on the black market used to be hundreds of dollars, and now it's like $1.98, something like that. It's really, really low. And so if anything, all these breaches have been really good because the market view, the black market value, people are going to use these maliciously at any sort of scale, is they're not worth anything.
Right. You're not suggesting we should look at the economic impacts and ramifications of the decisions we make.
Never.
I don't think we don't want to go there.
I think that's our last
I
one.
think this is going to be insightful or inciting. So
We keep talking about how we're going to keep band-aiding all the problems that are out there. What about fixing all the underlying issues? I mean, like, hey, let's go all the way down.
there's
to
good
network
money
and
to
go back to there
be
because-
made in selling surgical tape.
No,
Stop
that's
it.
fine. Right there. But then there's the whole psychological staff that goes on top of that from, you know, you've got a network and oh, it's my secure internal network, and then your sysadmins act a certain way because it's the internal network. It's not in the DMZ or out in the public side. And then you have people that are writing code that goes on top of those servers, and they're going, no, that's a secure internal network, so I don't have to worry about this stuff. And so you have all these layers of like this extra psychology that's going on top of it that if you maybe eliminate some of those really, really low level.
But the database
Like-
is encrypted,
But
except
not
when you're
like
using it.
like Mynagio's, not mine personally, but whoever had the idea that Mynagio's server didn't need HTTPS to log into the web interface because it's on the intranet, and then came to a security con and has credentials on the other side of that firewall right there on the Doppler box.
Yep.
Because they VPN, or they didn't VPN, they're open it to the internet, probably, hey, just so I can do a little admin log on, right?
One comment to build on, because I just recently had an argument with a developer.
No way.
I'm shocked.
It happens, and unfortunately I don't have technical knowledge to make myself dangerous. But the comment was, I'm working on an on-premise application. So if I'm going to deploy this application, I'm not worrying about security because that's the customer's responsibility because it's going to be inside their firewalls on the internet. We had a long talk after that. And I still think it goes down to the best way to prevent breaches in most organizations, and getting back to what data do you focus on, is awareness and education and training and understanding, a security architecture that makes sense and resonates. And it's not just the perimeter and all these other things. There's at least 6 logical layers to any security model. Get people to start thinking about that and building it out. We just don't do enough of that, so we have people that just continue creating problems for the organization and they just don't know each other.
Is it awareness or is it a stick? So in a lot of organizations, you're told it's against the rules to leave your laptop unattended and logged in, or leave it in your car. I know people work in organizations where they're clearly told if you do that, you're terminated, and those types of incidents rarely occur in those types of organizations.
It's the awareness of the stick.
Yeah.
Awareness of the stick.
Awareness of the
Exactly.
Yeah, a few questions in the back.
Not really a question, just want to add on, as somebody who often plays a developer role, I always think of it like we're already compromised. How do I leave the least?
Well, so that's a point, the last point that I want to make here is, a lot of this is getting back to root causes. If any of you mug me in the chill out room later, you will not be able to take $2,000 in cash from me because I am not carrying $2,000 in cash.
5,000?
No.
That's unfortunate.
It's in the
4
right
nights in a row
sock.
yeah, it's in my socks. 4 nights in a row at Frankie's, I'm dwindling on the cash thing. But if
Well, as a contrarian,
if
I
we
would
don't
say
have, we
they-
can't lose what we don't have. So we
True.
store.
But to the point that they're making, the question is, if we define everything as breached, we're always breached, what is the definition of a breach?
There's nothing
Well,
right.
compromised.
The perimeter is a lie.
All right, so we're out of time. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our
Thank you.
panelists.